Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, to the audience who are present here and those watching us online at home. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. So as mentioned by the General Manager, Madam Julina, that this is another session of the Cendekiawan Lestari Series organized by the Malay Heritage Foundation. And this will be the sixth and the final session for this first run. So we're very pleased that this morning we have Associate Professor Dr. Noor Aisha Abdul Rahman, who will be delivering a speech sharing her views on the Malay community. So as mentioned by Madam Julina, that this is the sixth session, and to date we have 5 speakers who have shared their research and also their views on the Malay community. They are featured here on the slides. As you can see that the session itself has showcased various aspects significant to the community. So we have covered numerous grounds relevant to the community, including issues dealing with politics, sociology, religious life, language, as well as literature. Yeah, so the Cendekiawan Lestari Series is part of our efforts as a foundation, part of our mission to safeguard Malay heritage for all. Some of you may be wondering why we are doing this lecture. I think there's this misconception when we deal with heritage issues. We tend to think of tangible cultural issues, mainly dances, artifacts. Rarely do we talk about intangible aspects of heritage, and such as intellectual heritage. So I think this is part of our efforts to fill this gap, to encourage our young to also understand the critical issues facing in our community. And often also, when we talk about heritage issues, we tend to have this perception that we are dealing with issues or matters that's passed from the older generations to the current generations. But I think we at MHF, we are also rethinking this. We are also looking at how we can pass our heritage today to the future generations. So hence we conduct these sessions, and part of our efforts to document as well as to publish some of these lectures. And most of these lectures, in fact, all of them have already been posted on our website. So please visit our website, www.mhf.org.sg, to download the previous papers delivered in this Cendekiawan Lestari series. There are also other aspects of documentation that you can also visit and also download from the website. We also feature the voices of youths, and these are some of the papers written by our young people, reflecting on the critical issues dealing with heritage and the Malay community. Yeah, so you can visit our website and also look at the Suara Belia Voices of Youth, a segment in the website. Apart from the Cendekiawan Lestari series, we also have other platforms catering for different audience. One of it is the Sembang Ilmu series, where we engage the young people to share their views on heritage critically. And in some of these sessions, we also encourage them to engage the more senior leaders in the community. So it's like a two-way flow session between seniors and also young people dealing. So we have a few of these sessions. Some of these were carried out on site, and some of these were done via Zoom sessions. Recordings of these sessions are also made available on our website. And lastly, we also have this lecture series conducted this year, starting from this year, by our Vice Chairman, Dr. Azhar Ibrahim, who is also a lecturer at the Malay Studies Department. So he has presented a series of lectures, and all these are also available online. You can visit them. It's called the Wacana Warisan series. So do take a look at these lectures. Apart from our Cendekiawan series, we also part of our business here at MHF is to also publish and document. So we have a series, a publication series, and we hope to grow this series in future. And we have also covered those issues such as literature, religious life, sastra, and so on. So yeah, so feel free to take a look at these publications and purchase them. All right, so that's basically a recap of the purpose of the Cendekiawan Lestari Series, as well as what we do at MHF. I will echo the General Manager's view that we wish to also thank our supporters. Today's session is organized at Wisma Geylang Serai. We wish to thank Wisma Geylang Serai staffs for helping out in making this session possible. We also wish to thank Yayasan Mendaki, particularly for this session, because this is in conjunction with the Raikan Ilmu Month, and we thank Yayasan Mendaki for the support. We also thank our media partners, Rita Media Corp as well as Rita Harian, for constantly featuring our series as well as our publications. So without further ado, may I just briefly introduce our speaker for this morning. None other than Associate Professor Dr. Noor Aisha Abdul Rahman. She is currently an Associate Professor at the Department of Malay Studies. She was also formerly the head of department of the Department of Malay Studies, and currently the co-director of the Social Service Research Council. So actually, Dr. Noor Aisha needs no introduction because for those of you who are graduates of the National University of Singapore, particularly in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, in one way or another, you must have taken Prof. Noor Aisha's modules. But Dr. Noor Aisha's research areas cover Malay religious life. She's particularly an expert on laws and legal matters, particularly, and she also teaches courses on Malay law and society, Islam and contemporary Malay society. And I've been very fortunate to be a student as well. And I'm sure many of you who have taken her courses would agree that she's one of the most critical mind and also a very engaging lecturer. And we hope to learn more from her sharing today. So without further ado, may I welcome Dr. Noor Aisha to begin her lecture. Dr. Noor Aisha, please.
Thank you, Dr. Shahril, Chairman of the Malay Heritage Foundation, for that very kind introduction. My distinguished guests, I have here Professor Syed Hussein, Professor Syed Farid Alatas, Dr. Rahim, and many of our friends here. Thank you for being here today. I've been given the honor of giving this last lecture in this lecture series for Malay Heritage Foundation, which I gladly accepted. And I hope that, whatever my reflections are today will be taken in the right spirit, and that it would serve as, further as a basis for further conversations on these issues that are confronting our community. Can you all hear me? A topic as wide as the theme of my lecture today, it is reflections on the Singapore Muslim community, cultural impediments and progress, necessarily entails a selection of specific issues of focus that are deemed pertinent and relevant for discussion. Our overriding aim is to analyze how the Muslim community, namely its elite and intelligentsia in various domains, have attempted to respond to these pertinent issues, and how these have shaped our culture and our understanding of our history, our tradition, and our values, relevant to helping us navigate our challenges in this period of rapid change. The episodes that I'm going to talk about today function as points of departure for the purpose of this lecture, but they're also closely intertwined with many interrelated issues affecting the community. The first episode occurred on September 12, 2001, Singapore time, when a vicious attack on the city of New York by a transnational terror group sent chilling repercussions worldwide and gripped Singapore with intense sense of fear and insecurity. The power of the American media had broadcasted the tragedy worldwide as it happened, thus globalizing the tragedy. Never had such a local tragedy reverberated to become the tragedy for humanity almost instantaneously. The tragedy was labeled as an Islamic terrorist attack on the civilized world because Islamic theological injunctions were used by the perpetrators to justify their deranged actions. Instead of instinctively and categorically denouncing and condemning the distortions of such claims as religious, dominant voices in the US and in many parts of the world readily framed the root of the tragedy as lying within Islam itself. More than 1 billion Muslims all over the world, with 1,400 years of civilizations, and irrespective of their diverse and rich cultural heritage, began to be called upon to explain and to clarify their religion and denounce violence and extremism. Muslim minority communities were no exceptions. They too were called upon to reaffirm their loyalty to their nation states via the imagined global community of the Islamic Ummah. Despite the complex web of causes which gave rise to the emergence of extremist, nationalist, transnational movements like Al-Qaeda, discourse on their emergence and terrorism was simplified and reduced to the problem of the religion, or more specifically, theological misunderstandings or misappropriation of the religion by Islamist, radical, and extremist groups. This framing of the tragedy and terrorism did not emerge suddenly. On the contrary, dominant political and academic views about Islam in the Western world, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall, had already become increasingly negative. The post-Cold War insurgencies by elements associated with the Muslims and transnational Islamic organizations, and the growing uneasiness with the expanding Muslim communities in Western countries had dominated the media and public opinion both in the West and at home. New narrative on the post-Cold War threat and a new intellectual framework were needed to replace the Cold War paradigm. Francis Fukuyama's The End of History had argued that the end of the Cold War in 1991 marked the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. This early euphoria of the victor was threatened by the new threat to their global interests in the form of radical Islam and Islamic fundamentalism. Benjamin Barber's 1995 book, Jihad versus McWorld, also addressed what was perceived as competing and threatening forces to the secular liberal ideas of the West, coming from tribalism and religious fundamentalism, especially Islamic fundamentalism. Then, in response to Fukuyama, Samuel Huntington, the author of The Clash of Civilizations and the Making of the World Order, had contended that the conflict between ideologies of the Cold War era had ended and is being replaced by the ancient conflict between civilizations along cultural lines. The civilization that dominates, he asserted, shaped the form of human government. Islam, he highlighted, had bloody borders with Western civilization. Yet another prominent scholar, Bernard Lewis, an influential expert in the US on Islam and the Middle East, had also in several of his works argued that the failure of the Islamic world to modernize or to keep pace with the West is the root of Muslim rage and its deep resentment of the West. He was the first to introduce the phrase clash of civilizations to describe what he deemed as opposing worldviews between Islam and Western civilization. In his words, the struggle of the fundamentalists is against two enemies, secularism and modernism. In Lewis's view, Islam is locked in its own struggle. Its effort to modernize is being opposed to by the Islamic fundamentalists. And he warned that if the fundamentalists are correct in their calculations and succeed in their war, then a dark future awaits the world, especially the part of it that embraces Islam. Lewis was also reported to have said that he had no doubt that September 11 attack was the opening salvo of the final battle between Western and Islamic civilizations. Osama bin Laden, in this view, was less an aberrant extremist. He was a mainstream expression of Muslim frustration, boiled over from the anti-Western nature of Islam. This dominant paradigm was brought right home here, following the event of October 2001, about 1 month after the September 11th tragedy, when Singapore announced the arrest of Jemaah Islamiyah operatives in its very own country. For the first time, Singaporeans were introduced to this elusive movement and its potent threat to the security of the nation. The JI, a regional-based terror organization affiliated to Al-Qaeda, was also responsible for the Bali tragedy in 2002. The perception of the civilizational clash was thus brought closer home. Singaporean Muslims were called upon to clarify the position of their religion vis-a-vis Western civilization. Islam, which is the dominant religion of the Malays, became a civilizational entity, a new fault line in the battle and clash of civilizations. No longer is Islam just the religion of the Malays. It is now a marker of a global civilization, which the Malays share with other Muslims, forming the ubiquitous Ummah. This imagined social, cultural, and political entity called the Ummah is deemed to be at odds with modern civilization, represented by democratic and pluralistic ideals. Political Islam is seen as a threat to democracy and the principles of the multicultural nation state. As a global city, this global fault line posed a potential threat to the city-state. The global fault line had become local, adding a new dimension to the religion and race fault lines of Singapore society. Prominent Muslim leaders and key Muslim organizations in Singapore were prompted to join the rest of the world to condemn the terror attack on September 11 and categorically reject any association of the act with Islam and Islamic teachings. Yet one cannot expect the dominant narrative of the clash of civilizations to be easily wished away by these mere condemnations and expressed rejections of violence. The problems of violence and terrorism had been predominantly framed as a cultural problem of the Muslims and as an Islamic theological anomaly. In a society organized on the basis of race, the stigmatization of Islam, it was feared, would easily be manipulated, creating backlash on the Malays. Thus, in the months following September 11, the government spearheaded a series of initiatives to enhance interreligious conversations and promote harmony between ethnic groups. Although these have helped counter any ethnic tension and stigma cast upon Islam, the deep-seated view that Islam is an impediment to social integration complicates genuine efforts to deal with the challenges. And the government also called for the moderate Muslims to speak up against radical Islam and terror inflicted in the name of Islam. As the problem has been predominantly perceived as a culturalist one, it is believed that only the Muslims can best resolve them, and that this resolution is critical for the well-being of the nation. Non-Muslims, they claim, needed assurance that their Muslim compatriots do not harbor, and nor does Islam teach us violence and hate towards others of different faiths. This is indeed a mammoth task. The community has still to deal with pre-existing prejudices on Islam, reinforced by dominant Western narratives about Islam and the actions of radicalized Muslims in Singapore and abroad. It required Muslim leaders and the intelligentsia to constantly be on guard against all sorts of influences from within and abroad, even as the community struggled with the social and economic challenges of a rapidly changing world. Dominant narrative of clash of civilization, especially concerning Muslims' attitude towards secular states and its institutions, and on modernization are equally central, as it is articulated as a challenge for ethnic integration, social cohesion, and religious harmony. Integrating the Malays into the mainstream and ensuring Muslim loyalty to the nation via their emotional affiliation to fellow Muslims has been a major concern and still is. These concerns preceded September 11, but were intensified and heightened by the tragic event. Certain religious practices of Muslims are still regarded as obstacles in the ongoing project of national integration. Muslims lack involvement in grassroots and national multi-ethnic platforms. They are perceived to be stricter in the observances of dietary restrictions, attire and lifestyles, which have all been expressed as signs of concern. The more recent focus on Arabization and its impact on religious practices and norms are also part of this looming concern. It is not unreasonable to state that no other religious communities have ever been called to embark on such mammoth socio-cultural project to counter extremist ideologies. This is essentially the role of the cultural elite, its intellectuals and intelligentsia in the society. The call for moderates to respond and take up the challenge is hardly useful, as it neither helps us identify the group that drives the community's culture, nor does it enable us to understand their thought and orientation on concrete issues. The challenge against radicalism and fundamentalism requires huge intellectual resources, which is clearly beyond the capacity of any one community. Moreover, the risks of creeping hate and violent ideologies is not exclusive to the ideology of some Muslims and their religious views, but transcend them. I started this lecture with the episode of September 11 and the dominant intellectual and public opinions about Islam and the Muslims at the turn of the 20th century, 21st century as a point of departure. It will help us understand the response of the Muslim intelligentsia to the dominant narratives about the Muslims and the challenges of the community. I'm not here to discuss how Islam and the Muslims got entangled into the world order after the fall of the Berlin Wall, or the problems of transnational insurgencies, or the rise of transnational movements like Al-Qaeda and the GI. I would like to spend some time to discuss the response of dominant Muslim religious elite and intelligentsia in Singapore to the dominant narrative of the clash of civilization and the allegation of theological anomaly of Islam in modern society. The incident has also challenged the religious elite to deal with the aftermath of September 11 as Muslims face backlash and stigmatization by fellow Singaporeans. Their thought on Islam, its nature and their orientations have serious ramifications, not only on the problems of extremism, but also on wider problems affecting the development of the community. The role of the community's dominant elite and its intelligentsia as drivers of its culture and religious tradition is crucial in shaping its transformation in this time of rapid change. The nature of their response to these challenges determines whether they are catalytic of society's socio-cultural development or pose an impediment to this. I shall focus my attention on two pieces of documents which best reflect the views of the religious elite in dealing with the ideological challenges from various parties. On September 2003, Pergas, the Association of Muslim Scholars in Singapore, undertook what it deems as a direct counter-ideological initiative against Al-Qaeda and JI ideology by organizing the Convention of Ulama. The objective of the convention was to rally Muslim scholars to define and combat extremism. The gathering culminated in a book entitled Moderation in Islam in the Context of the Muslim Community in Singapore. One of the major contributors of the book maintained that it is particularly relevant to counter ideological efforts in two respects. It highlights key extremist thinking and misinterpretations of Islam and offer rebuttals using the same arguments employed by Al-Qaeda. Secondly, it offers a 27-point charter of moderation for the Muslim community in Singapore. The charter, he claimed, is useful in guiding the community to practice Islam in the context of Singapore, particularly for Muslim scholars and religious teachers in their drive to promote moderation. It was a blueprint for the organization to help guide its members. At the very outset, The problem has been defined by Pergas as theological in nature and hence required theological counter-arguments. The book alluded to Pergas as the representative of moderate views and therefore guardian of the true teachings of Islam. In actuality, the prescriptive views are that of a small group of religious elite who attempted an authoritative framing of religious discourse and the teachings of Islam in Singapore. This lecture does not permit me to discuss the entire content of the book. I have discussed key issues raised in the book elsewhere in my works. I would encourage others to read them and welcome constructive comments so that we can benefit from our collective wisdom. Suffice to say here that although the book was positioned as a counter-ideology to the extremists, it was certainly not a critique of the ideology of Al-Qaeda or JI as a transnational movement, nor was it an analysis of the political thought of their founders and thinkers. The book also did not provide an analysis of the factors that have conditioned the rise and appropriation of such thought by the followers of the movement, or does it offer a progressive Islamic political thought for contemporary society? The book is not a critique of the dominant views, which essentialize Islam as a civilization that clashes with modern civilization, which has been similarly essentialized with an idealized imagination of values of liberal democracy based on Judeo-Christian traditions. On the contrary, it contains abstract exaltations of theological principles that do not provide much insights into the concrete phenomena of extremism or the constant struggle of Muslims making sense of their religion and cultural traditions in this period of rapid social change. Lack of insights into the socio-historical context of the phenomena, the nature of thought that has emerged from it, the forces which support and sustain these ideas cannot shed light on the ideology of the extremists, the individual actors, the group, and the movement. The complexity of the problem of terrorism and its ideology cannot be simply reduced to a theological matter resolved by theological arguments. The battle in countering the ideology of extremism cannot be achieved by offering counter-theological views. Theological proclamations and justifications do not provide insights into personal motivations, group interests, social and psychological experiences shrouded in religious rhetoric and dogma. Theological exhortations often invite counter-theological viewpoints amongst experts to justify violence. It opens doors to allow for one theological viewpoint to be pitted against another. Equating theological viewpoints with ideologies fits Bernard Lewis's thesis that terrorism and violence are crises within Islam itself in dealing with secularism and modernization. The book has in fact affirmed the very thesis of the conflict of civilization. It also declared the group's strong commitment to political Islam. It made obligatory for Muslims to believe and to strive for political Islam. By political Islam, it does not mean the infusion of universal ethical and moral values informed by Islam into our social and political institutions and principles and policy of governance. On the contrary, the authors deem political Islam as part of an imagined total system of Islam, with all its essential elements like the constructed laws and institutions referred to as hudud and shura, which are regarded as not subject to revaluation. Although the authors claim that these are obligatory for Muslims to believe and strive for, the book also asserts that it is not obligatory for Muslims in Singapore to practice these as they are numerical minority and politically emasculated. Violence, they asserted, also cannot be justified for the application of the total system which they claim is fundamental to Islamic belief. The principle of minority fiqh, which they import from Qaradawi, allows them to accommodate the rules and policies of the secular state by often invoking the principle of darura. The attitude towards secular institutions, laws, and agencies is that of tolerance. These institutions are tolerated because they allow for Muslims to practice their basic religious tenets of Islam. Intellectual affiliation for the views expressed in the book are not drawn from the region's religious and cultural traditions. For instance, the thinking of numerous leaders of the two powerful movements in Indonesia, which have never resorted to political Islam, but use religion as basis for support of the democratic, secular, pluralistic state, NU and Muhammadiyah, were hardly mentioned. Instead, references to the writings of Ismail Faruqi, Hassan al-Banna, Said Qutb, Yusuf Qaradawi, etc. recurred. Issues raised also reflect striking resemblance to those taking place among more recent migrants in the West, grappling with issues of identity as minorities in the context of largely Western, non-Muslim majority states. I can't go into all these issues here. You can look at some of my writings on that. I've published about 2 articles on that, I think. But essentially, their mode of thinking as reflected in the issues raised and conceived can best be described as fundamentalist. In fact, the book celebrated the use of the term fundamentalist, which it takes to mean believing in the totality of an Islamic system of life, which is based on what it deems as divine dictates and principles. This, it claims, is distinguishable from the modern secular system, although it also shares with the latter some similar features like democracy and pluralism. Yet what these similar features are in theory and praxis are not clearly defined and left to one's imagination. However, in practice, one can see that tolerance of divergence views of religion within the community has not been very forthcoming for this dominant religious elite. The only difference between the fundamentalists who strive for a totality of Islamic system with that advocated by Progress is the use of violence. The difference with the extremists is not in the structure of thought of a fundamentalist, but the use of violence. The difference lies in the application of the instrument of power. The fundamentalist striving for the totality of Islamic system for the minority community comes in drip and drips, like demand for tudung, Islamic finance, halal certification, religious schools, and others through civic and political advocacy. As a guide, the abstract exhortations of rules in the Charter cannot seriously and adequately guide Muslim scholars in tackling future challenges and in dealing with existential challenges of competing ideologies in so many relevant areas of human existence. Although the principles listed in the guide are sound and are generally known, the lack of illustration of its applications in tackling some of the concrete challenges and issues in contemporary society limits its efficacy as a meaningful and constructive guide. Religious teachers are often selective in application of these principles. For example, among religious teachers, there is a general suspicion, if not dislike, for certain faith communities like the Jews, Christians, Ahmadis, or even Malays who adopted Shi'i version of Islam, or uphold opinions and practices on Islam that may not be quite mainstream. There's also general ignorance and suspicion among many religious teachers about secular apparatus and institutions like the state, education, and laws. There are many concrete contemporary challenges and issues which require fresh examination of the application of universal Islamic principles of engagement. These urgently need clarifications and guidance, which principles reiterated in abstract do not address. Apart from Pergas, the Muslim Religious Council of Singapore, or MUIS, also took the cue of the dominant clash of civilization framework and worked toward averting such clash. The approach it adopted was to imagine a community of excellence in socio-religious life in the Singapore context. MUIS attempted to reconcile the concept of excellence from the religious perspective with the social. MUIS's idea of excellence in socio-religious life is represented by 10 desired attributes. What is MUIS's understanding of religious excellence? Let me quote from the introduction to Risalah, MUIS's document for building of this imagined model society. And this is the quote. From religious perspective, excellence means the ability to perform the rituals of Islam while appreciating their significance and internalizing the values embedded within them. By doing so, we are able to manifest the beauty of this religion. This beauty, when shared with humanity, will bring goodness to everyone. In other words, a Muslim community of excellence is one that is religiously profound. Muissa's idea of social excellence is equally limited. Let me quote from the Risalah. In the social sense, excellence refers to our ability to fully partake in nation building and to position ourselves as full members of Singaporean society. In other words, a Muslim community of excellence is one that is also socially progressive. 10 attributes delineated which Muiz necessitates for the creation of a community of excellence include holding on strongly to Islamic principles while adapting to changing contexts, appreciating Islamic civilization and history, having a good understanding of contemporary issues, appreciating other civilizations, being morally and spiritually strong, practicing Islam beyond rituals, and riding on the modernization wave, being well adjusted and contributive to Singapore's multiracial society and the secular state, etc., etc. For each of these attributes, prominent Muslims from the past or present are presented as exemplary figures. Muissa's approach to address the dominant narrative of civilizational clash between Islam and the West is by presenting the attributes of the ideal imagined Muslim society. It totally ignored the dominant cultural critique of Islam as a civilization pitted against the West. The essentializing of Islam's religious and cultural traditions are prevalent in the dominant views about Islam amongst both Muslims and others. The Risalah could have presented the diversity of Islamic religious and cultural traditions, especially from Nusantara, the wealth of materials of Muslim thinkers from the Malay world who have done much to ground the values, ethics, and aesthetics informed by Islam into Malay culture and traditions were totally absent. Instead, quotes from Islamists like Qardawi on the ideal type of society or even on matters of Islamic economics and law were upheld. While several prominent classical Muslims were highlighted as models of the 10 attributes, the intellectual contributions of indigenous scholars, past and present, hardly featured. And here I'm saying people like Syed Hussein Alatas, Natsir, Sojat Moko, Kunto Wijoyo, Hazairin, and even in the past, Jokro Minuto, at present, Chandra Muzaffar, Shahruddin Matruf, even my colleague, Syed Farid Alatas, right? And other theologians like Abdul Rahman Wahid, Nur Khalis Majid, Shafi'i Ma'rif, etc., and a host of other literary thinkers, all of whom have battled with religion and impediments to pluralism, social justice, civil society, and the role of Islam in nation building were simply absent in the quest for excellence. The Risalah is a brief piece of work with abstract ideas which offer limited guidance for Muslims on their traditions and glosses over many problems on how these attributes operate in the context of existential problems of the community. Assertions of Islamic values of excellence formulated in abstract do not suffice and to ensure meaningful appreciation in meeting concrete problems of contemporary society. How these values can be institutionalized are also not discussed. Another major omission is the effort to engage in self-reflection on the major cultural and religious impediments to the community of excellence. There are many backward and negative religious views in circulation that need to be tackled. Yet none of these impediments that thwart the realization of the 10 attributes were identified and analyzed. Among these are views peddled by religious fundamentalists that subscribe to rigid and Puritan views on Islam at the expense of concrete problems, including poverty, inequality, social exclusion, gender disparity, oppression against the weak, and other problems. Belief in irrationalism woven into Islam that impedes our religious and cultural atmosphere is yet another aspect of religious life that, hamper satisfactory condition of the community, also not discussed. Other impediments long pointed out by scholars include the disproportionate emphasis on rituals as opposed to the ethical teachings of the religion, individual and personal salvation to the point of neglecting social problems, the focus on otherworldly concerns at the expense of concrete historical problems of life, so many other other things, right, that are not taken into consideration. Such fixations impede the spirit of excellence based on universal philosophy, freed from dogma and irrationality. To these could be added many other impediments, which were not discussed in the Risala, though they reflect reality. These include the lack of critical consciousness of factors conditioning our religious framework, which in turn influence the very selection and omission of problems and the sense of priority and marginalization of issues. Commitment to common humanity. I'm saddened by that until now, our religious elites still debate about whether we can wish non-Muslims on their religious festivals, right? And things like that. Okay? So there are so many impediments which I feel, right, could have been taken into consideration in writing the Risala, which would be a more effective guiding tool for our community. Within an increasingly complex and pluralistic society, diversity of views on Islam are only to be expected. Yet moral panic and pejorative labeling are often invoked against those whose views may not be mainstream or not dominant within the spectrum of religious views. Added to these is the danger of lack of acknowledgement of limitations in areas where one does not have expertise, but yet use Islam in peddling these views. These impediments are not exhaustive, but reflect concrete problems that must be addressed if religion is to play a relevant and positive role in building a community of excellence. I have some more areas to talk about, so I hope that you will bear with me. So that was religion, right? Now I'll move on to history. In the 2018 New Year message, announcing the 200th anniversary of Raffles Landing, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong acknowledged the long and complex history of Singapore that stretches back at least 700 years as a maritime emporium in the 14th century. It was the first time that Singapore's official history got its clock turned back to 700 years and possibly beyond in the history of maritime trade. This runs counter to the conventional narrative that Singapore had been only a backward fishing village when Raffles landed. Initially, many people, especially the Malays, saw this as an opportunity at reconstructing Singapore's official history by incorporating the pre-colonial political and cultural history of the Malays that went back to Malacca and the Srivijaya Empire. The erection of the statue of Sang Nila Utama, the 14th century founder of the native maritime port, was seen to restore the native prince and somehow deny Raffles' status as the founder of Singapore. The elaborate enactment of the tales from Sulalatu Salatin, or the Malay Annals, at the National Day Parade was also seen by the Malay cultural elite as Singapore's readiness to reconstruct its official history beyond 1819 by incorporating the pre-colonial Malay historical elements. The more recent discovery of archaeological evidence of the old maritime city and the establishment of the historical gardens at Fort Canning were further seen as indicators of the state's effort at the recovery of Malay history. These developments confirm the story of Sejarah Melayu about the greatness of Singapore as a native maritime city. However, they do not bear much historical significance in understanding the establishment of modern Singapore, nor our development as a nation. The Malay cultural elite saw these as an effort at historical redemption of the Malays as the indigenous people of Singapore, although this status, which is embedded in the nation's constitution, has never been officially disputed. The consistent and continuous message of Singapore's struggle as a society of migrant communities and the thesis that the term Malay was the construction of the British, which referred to the plethora of migrant communities from the region, had irked the Malays. There's also the general dislike for Raffles, who was seen as the manipulator of the rift between the Malay ruling class, which led to the eventual secession of the island to the British. The Malays' commemoration of the bicentennial revolved around the attack on Raffles, discussions on pre-colonial Malay history that stretched back to Malacca, the famous Malay maritime empire that succeeded Srivijaya. In the Malay Annals, the Sultans of Malacca and Johor traced their ancestry to the Srivijayan kings. A book, Beyond Bicentennial, Perspective on Malays, was produced to document Malay contributions to Singapore. The articles in the book, written mainly by the Malay intelligentsia, according to the editors, served to balance perspectives that adopted the uncritical stance towards British colonial rule, providing alternative viewpoints towards Raffles and the British, as the historical narratives of Singapore have been much more focused on and influenced by the colonial standpoint. The editors further stated that the bicentennial provides us with the opportunity to reflect and re-examine the position of the Malays in Singapore's history. The title, Beyond Bicentennial, reflects their desire that the history of Singapore should be studied beyond 200 years. These were the recurring dominant perspectives on how the Malays in Singapore felt about the bicentennial. While one can understand and empathize with the dislike for Raffles and the attachment to the pre-colonial cultural and political history of the Malays in their historical and social memory, these have, however, to some extent impeded discussions and understanding of the Prime Minister's message in conjunction with the commemoration of the bicentennial. As a matter of fact, historical discourse on Singapore's long history had started much earlier. The 700 years of history was informed by the book written by 3 Singapore historians titled Singapore 7-Year History from Early Emporium to World City, first published in 2009. Then Minister for Information, Communication and Arts, Louis Pak Yew, had asserted that the history presented in the book effectively expands the singular historical narrative of Singapore, pushing its boundaries by adding depth and layers to the evolving Singapore. The authors had said that the book situates its current concerns about Singapore's status as a global city in the post-Cold War cycle of globalization, within the larger framework of earlier cycles of globalization, and linked what was happening to the wider spatial context of the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. Viewed contextually, the book is strongly intertwined with geopolitical and economic discourses at the end of the 1990s and early part of 2000 on Asia that latched on the grand narrative of the Asian century. The extension of historical timeline of Singapore's history to 700 years was to serve Singapore's new strategic interests, latching on the grand narratives of the world of the 21st century as the Asian century. The Nalanda University project, announced by the Indian president during his visit to Singapore in 2005, much driven by Singapore and supported by other East Asian countries, was conceived as a strong instrument of soft power for rising Asia in relation to the West. It was to boost Asia's confidence in its intellectual and academic capacities, rivaling great Western universities like Oxford and Harvard, and reflecting Asia's emergence, according to Amartya Sen, the founding chairman of the university. George Yeo, then Singapore's foreign minister, described the project as the icon of Asian Renaissance. In his words, as Asia re-emerges on the world stage this century, its civilizational origins will become a subject of intense study and debate. Asians, he added, will look back to their own past and derive inspiration from it for the future. In support of the project, the Srivijaya Nalanda Center was established in ISIS Yusof Ishak in 2009. One of the objectives of the center was to develop the Nalanda idea, the Srivijaya idea of Southeast Asia, as a place of mediation and linkages between great civilizations and amongst them. It was to embody an appreciation of Asian achievements and mutual learning, as exemplified by the Cosmopolitan Buddhist Center of Learning in Nalanda and Srivijaya. More recently, big powers like China and India have embarked on the promotion of mythologies and appropriated images of their interactions with the ancient maritime Silk Road to project their geo-economic and political strategies. countries in Southeast Asia's deep social memories of their interactions with Imperial China and the Indian kingdoms will shape their understanding and response to any invitation to partake in the new economic initiative of these big powers. It now becomes clear that how countries, including Singapore, understand the geo-economic and political contestations of maritime Southeast Asia today depends on how they reflect and reconstruct the history of the ancient maritime trade. The discourse on the history of Singapore, which situates its strategic interest within the framework of historic long cycles of maritime Southeast Asia, linked with China and India, was and is not within the radar of the Malay community's elites. When the book was first published in 2009, it escaped the attention of the Malay cultural elites. The book may seem not quite relevant to them, as it did not touch on the history of the Malay kings or on Malay cultural history. The Nalanda discourse, which focused on Srivijaya's commercial, cultural, and religious interactions with India and China, also escaped the attention of the community's elites who do not share the culture and the religious beliefs of Srivijaya. Yet the history of maritime long cycles is significant in adding to our understanding of the movement of not just trade, but people, culture, and ideas, the elements of soft power. It is equally important in understanding the rise and fall of native port cities and the rise and fall of the Malay ruling and trading classes. In short, the long history of Malay polities, culture, and ideas can best be better informed by this framework of economic cycles. This perspective has been used by historians to argue that the economic activities of the Temenggung and the Bugis traders' settlement in Singapore before the British landed in 1819 was the period of early revitalization of the economic cycle and not as the sleepy backward port as what has been dominantly portrayed in official history. Malay cultural elites can ride on such frameworks and approaches to ask relevant questions and expand their reflections on the culture and ideas of the dominant class, and in so doing contribute to a better understanding of the rise and fall of Malay maritime dominant classes and other societies. There are always gaps in the way we construct the past. Malay cultural elites and intelligentsia can contribute to this effort to reconstruct our history by asking relevant questions. Being conscious of these serious attempts at the reconstruction of Singapore's maritime long cycle of history via India and China does not mean that one should not be conscious of ideological influences in the reconstruction of Singapore's history. It is nonetheless necessary to develop awareness and harness relevant approaches and perspectives from these developments to address questions useful to uncovering the social history of the Malays. The second narrative is about the history of the nation. This is not new. Modern Singapore was deemed to have started with the establishment of a colonial port by Raffles. The narrative serves the need of building a nation out of multicultural communities with a shared history. What has shifted is the attempt to deal with the more varied narratives about Singapore's history and its multicultural communities. It has become no longer prudent from the top-down approach to construct and dictate the official Singapore story. The Prime Minister himself had called on for more bottoms-up construction of Singapore's history as a nation. In his bicentennial message, the Prime Minister had remarked that it is far better to simply allow for a heterogeneous mosaic of stories to be told without drawing easy conclusions and letting those stories act as natural building blocks in the construction of a more textured understanding of history by Singaporeans. These have come mainly from recorded social memories of communities, curatorial heritage projects, films, performing arts over the last 60 years or so. In 1965, Singapore took the decision to name Raffles, the British imperialist, as the founder of modern Singapore, although the leaders were fully aware of the negative aspects of colonial rule. Singapore's struggle for independence was, after all, an anti-imperialist struggle. However, the leaders also acknowledged positive aspects of British imperial rule. As Rajaratnam had asserted then, national history of the new nation must attempt to preserve the best aspect of British rule, and the narrative of the new nation serves this purpose. The leaders also saw the value of keeping Raffles's association with Singapore, as it served the strategic interest of the country by sending a positive signal to foreign investors of the country's commitment to free trade and the protection of their investments. Choosing 1819 as the starting point of Singapore's modern history was also motivated by the urgency to build a common shared history. Rajaratnam believed that the establishment of Singapore as an imperial outpost, which brought people of diverse ethnic and religious backgrounds from various places, was a good starting point. The government, he said, had been careful about the kind of awareness of the past it should inculcate in a multiracial society. For the Malays, adaptation to the demands of the new political, economic, and social conditions had posed serious challenges. They developed an enigmatic frame of mind as they suddenly became a minority after separation, relatively poor and socioeconomically backward, while confronted with the dilemma of being isolated from the region with people whom they had shared their culture, their history, political and ancestral ties. This dilemma was captured succinctly by Rahim Ishak in the early period of independence. In his words, the Malays today, consequent upon Singapore's separation from Malaysia, were placed in a dilemma of being a minority, relatively poor and backward, and yet living in a country where people of their own race, religion, culture, and language predominate and decisively hold sway in their political lives. Under the circumstances, he added, we must try to understand deeply and with utmost sympathy this enigmatic frame of mind the Malays are in, for no fault of their own. It is important that we find a long-term solution to the problem of theirs, that is, of being isolated, so to speak, in their own home country. The social memory of this enigmatic frame of mind was mainly recorded in the literary works of a small number of Malay writers. The number of Malay writers and Malay intelligentsia in Singapore had by then depleted because of the exodus to Malaysia after the independence of Malaya in 1957 and exacerbated by the isolation after independence. The exodus of the Malay intelligentsia and talent to Malaysia continued long after separation. Even earlier on in 1963, Konfrontasi launched by President Sukarno on Singapore and Malaysia had already isolated the Malay intelligentsia from their cultural counterparts in Indonesia. The intellectual and cultural linkage that hitherto prevailed never quite recovered, and the severance reinforced as Malay cultural intelligentsia continued to look inward in their efforts to develop themselves. The saving grace was the establishment of the Department of Malay Studies at the then University of Singapore by the late Syed Hussein Alatas in 1967. Works of Alatas and scholars from the department, critical of colonial writing and scholarship, and on the Malay feudal class, paved the way for new perspectives, not only on colonial history, but also history of Malay feudalism and the Malay ruling class. The employment of multidisciplinary and socio-historical perspectives in the study of history, cultural traditions of the Malays, and the history of ideas provided much needed intellectual perspectives and balas to help the Malay cultural intelligentsia examine Singapore's history and the community's social memories, old and in contemporary times. One area of studies which had been given much attention at the department is the critical study of colonial history and colonial scholarship and their serious ramifications on the progress and well-being of our society. Continuity of colonial ideas had strongly affected the mental framework of the nation's intelligentsia on how they understand their society and nation. Colonial scholarship on Malay culture and its history has remained so dominant as to shape the perspectives of the intelligentsia in the reconstruction of the community's own social memory. This can be seen in the curation of stories on Malay communities in museums and cultural centers, for example. Critical awareness of this intellectual captivity and its serious ramifications on identity formation of the Malays and others was spearheaded by Prof. Alatas and his students at the department. In his bicentennial commemorative message, the Prime Minister had warned against a simplistic exercise to determine if colonialism had been good or bad for Singapore. He must have been concerned with the ramifications of contemporary movements of decolonization in former colonial countries that have taken expressions against anti-white privilege. The narrative that the Chinese was a privileged group in colonized countries in the Malay world socioeconomically may similarly result in anti-Chinese sentiments which do not augur well for Singapore and neighboring pluralistic societies. This dangerous view has been circulating among nativistic anti-Chinese movements in the region. The way to counter such narrative is not to avoid critical examination of colonial capitalism and its impact. On the contrary, simplistic views on the positive impact of colonial capitalism in our stories of nation building, that success during the colonial era was all about a matter of working hard, had enhanced the perception gap between races on the impact of colonialism. The ramifications of colonial capitalism on various communities have not been properly understood. We have not been able to share stories of the common struggles of the poor and the weak, oppressed by the exploitation of privileged class in colonial history. Such exploitative interactions were not confined to the British, but cut across all racial groups. The collusion between the privileged native and colonial powers at the expense of the poor across all racial groups has often been overlooked or missed. Critical studies of such economic interactions facilitated by colonial capitalism is very pertinent in understanding contemporary problems of class division and inequality, which are often clouded by racial categories. The Malay Studies Department had spearheaded such research since independence. At the same time, the department has also embarked on critical studies on Malay feudalism and its continuity amongst the new Malay intelligentsia. It is highly important to mitigate the rise of xenophobic and chauvinistic ideas of Malay history and culture. How the Malays and others can benefit from these to craft a new narrative about colonialism and pre-colonial history that avoids the problems of parochial ethno-nationalism, ideology and utopian fundamentalism that we see ravaging among some groups within the region will depend very much on the cultural perspectives of our intelligentsia. The dominant view that Raffles' landing in 1819 was a key turning point in history that set a different trajectory, which brought our different communities together for betterment of lives and fortunes, cannot be a singular narrative about the history of the nation. The Johor Temenggong's relocation to Singapore in 1811 and the development of settlements, including that of Chinese planters and Bugis traders, tell a story of continuity in the economic cycles of Singapore. The port and harbour built by the Temenggong and the region under his control allowed for the establishment of regional and trans-regional trading networks, which gave the British the opportunity to expand further. Raffles did not sail into political economic vacuum. The Prime Minister's suggestion for Singaporeans to reflect on how the nation came into being, how we have come this far since, and how we can go forward together, should allow for alternative narratives on the founding of modern Singapore. The alternative narrative should be part of the remaking of our nation's history. It's already in the social memory of the Malays, and this should eventually seep into the historical awareness of the nation. The Prime Minister himself had warned Singapore not to turn the commemorative into a simple exercise to determine if colonialism had been good or bad. He suggested it is far better to allow for a heterogeneous mosaic of stories, etc. And if this warts and all approach to Singapore is the right one to take, should it not apply also, one might argue, to how Singapore examines all periods of its history, whether that is centuries old or just decades old? The heterogeneous mosaic of stories of the Malay community have proliferated. Varieties of works from literature to curatorial work in libraries and museums, and from films to performing arts, attempt to capture the social memories of the community. The proliferation has been facilitated by the expansion of the cultural intelligentsia, better state funding of social memory projects, and platforms to tell the stories. However, the production of works on Malay cultural memories and heritage are still far less than that produced by the Chinese community. This reflects the level of intellectual resources and social capital available in the Malay community. Works that are critical of the official history or critical of normative community memories, or those considered outside mainstream narratives are rather limited. Ideas that are critical of memories of dominant religious and cultural elites are often not shared with other communities. For that matter, interest in such critical works is rather limited. Cultural elites of different communities tend to work in silos within their own cultural and intellectual enclaves. Social and cultural sensitivities also prevent others outside the Malay community to engage critically in its social memory. It is seldom that we come across cultural activists who can function across communities to produce and share narratives that are critical of normative social memory of the community. Although many of the community memory projects are available in English, there are still cultural elements that are not so easily transferred just by having access to the English language. The need for cultural translators in the community is thus pertinent. Their roles and function go beyond simple translation of language. Familiarity with cultural knowledge and nuances across different cultures are critical. Cultural essentialism and prejudice often complicate efforts to share ideas across communities. In Singapore, where race and language form the basis of managing our cultural projects, the task of creating stories of common experiences shared by all to emerge out of the tapestry of heterogeneous mosaic of stories render the need for cultural translators more critical. We have yet to see serious efforts amongst cultural intelligentsia to develop skills and competencies needed for cultural translators or mediators. The community's lack of cultural translators may impede the incorporation of the community's social memories into mainstream narratives. The development of such translators is critical for the minority Malay community. In areas where the Malays have good cultural translators, stories get better shared across communities. There are few amongst the Malay cultural intelligentsia who operate comfortably between societies. They are found, for instance, amongst those working in interfaith and inter-ethnic circles, and also in the art sector, especially in theatre, where there is greater opportunities to articulate ideas with a common language. But even in these areas, resources are inadequate. There are also other issues, other struggles of this community, including also bridging ideas within a community, right? So, I mean, that I'm just trying to say that, these are the gaps, right, in how we can transmit our cultures within as well as between cultural groups. I have one more issue. I know it's been a very long lecture. I just one more, okay? Because I've spoken about religion, about history and culture, and different intelligentsias and their challenges and how they have responded. There's just one more which I think is not. It would be injustice maybe not to talk about it, so I'll just try and do it quickly. And this is about gender. Okay? On 20th September 2020, the Ministry of Social and Family Development launched Conversations on Women's Development to kickstart the national effort to identify and tackle issues still affecting women in Singapore. This ongoing review is a major government initiative to address the cultural and structural impediments that still confront Singaporean women nearly 6 decades after independence. Although the position of women in many areas such as education and politics and their contributions to the economy have improved significantly since independence, the advancement of women's interests in these areas are still work in progress, to quote Minister Shanmugam. He also admitted that there remains cultural, social, structural hurdles in alleviating the lag. Over the past 60 years or more, women's participation in all areas of the public sphere has been phenomenal. The demographic shift reflects in as much as it necessarily demands change and reforms in our culture, social structure, and the way we organize society. The Women's Charter, introduced in 1961, provided the legal framework for sweeping changes to the rights of women. Looking back, one wonders how these rights, which are so basic, have to be accorded to women through a special piece of legislation. But the act was clearly needed to secure the rights and protect women's interests, as cultural traditions, norms, and the social structure were slower to adjust to the changing conditions of society. Although Muslim women were exempted from certain provisions of the Women's Charter with regards to marriage and divorce, where Muslim law under AMLA applies, many areas of their rights are protected by the Charter. There was some initial resistance, especially from traditionalist groups. The disruption and displacement gave rise to a sense of insecurity within these groups. However, the substantive merit of the reform and the reality of the social conditions of the time enabled cultural views and norms to adapt accordingly. Education of women, their participation in the workforce, and their participation in the struggle for independence of Malaya had empowered women for changes ahead. The firm support of the political and cultural elite and the intelligentsia had enabled the changes and reforms to proceed. Since then, several laws and regulations have been ushered to protect the rights of women and on family matters where women's interests are inextricably linked. But there are still many unresolved issues on the equal treatment of women. The Conversation of Women series have become very much the affair of women. Only 25% of the participants so far are men. This reflects deep-seated cultural attitude about gender inequality issues. The expansion of women intelligentsia has enabled issues faced by women to be championed by fellow women. The lack of participation of men in the discourse on gender inequality may be indicative of the level of concern felt by men over these issues and the persistence of gender disparity. Gender disparities are a persistent form of inequality in every country. No country in the world, rich or poor, has achieved gender equality. The Global Gender Gap Report of 2020 had placed Singapore as 54th among 153 countries. We are one rank below the US, but lower than the Philippines and Bangladesh. The Gender Norm Index, using a slightly older data source from 2010 to 14, showed that 9 in 10 people are prejudiced against women, less so in education, but more in politics. Chaopao editorial published in September last year, while seemingly supporting women's rights, reminded readers to acknowledge the reality of differences between men and women, justifying the traditional view of gender traits and different social roles through millions of years of evolutionary history. Similar arguments have been used by some religious teachers in the Muslim community, invoking what they claim as divine design and command on general and abstract ideas of women without tackling specific problems faced by them. Malay women are not free from traditional cultural restrictions on their gender role. The conflation of religious views on gender roles with cultural practices complicates the discourse on gender inequality in the Malay society. Discussions on cultural impediments in the Malay community often encounter minefields of religious ideas, which are not easy to negotiate. Many of these views are plucked from the time when women's involvement and roles in the public sphere were limited. Some views affecting women are fairly recent. Earlier Muslim practices based on Islam, which have been modified by custom and sanctioned by religious and cultural elite of that time, are now replaced by ideas brought by the resurgence of Islam, which include examples such as the hijab being mandatory as an expression of women's modesty, division of property issues, and women's prescribed roles in the family, requiring them to seek permission of their husbands to go out to work when leaving the house. We often hear arguments that women's rights in Islam are not based on gender equality, but on gender equity and gender justice. Discourse on gender, which is critical of certain Islamic practices, are often labeled as Western feminists or liberal Muslim ideas as against Islamic ideas of women's rights. These generalized attacks and labeling will not help us identify and clarify concrete issues facing Muslim women. Gender equality refers to equal treatment, equity, and justice whenever it applies. One cannot say that Islam does not recognize equal treatment for women in any matter. There are so many areas where Islamic norms require equal treatment of women. On the other hand, the secular view on gender equality in our current discourse does not demand rigid equal treatment in all matters where such would be of no good to women. Only when we examine concrete and specific issues can we decide which of these should apply. Similarly, using terms like toxic masculinity and patriarchy without understanding issues dealing with the problems of managing change in the community cannot contribute to alleviating the problem. Cultural lag, which affects different parts of the culture of a community, is a complex problem to manage. the type of cultural elites, and their orientations determine the pace and nature of adaptation. Rhetorical debates and labeling will not help understand and develop relevant and useful perspectives to deal with women's problems. Gender justice must start with accepting equal treatment for women, and any differential treatment to women must be reasoned and justified by considering the challenges, needs, and specific conditions faced by women in the context of the society we live in. Now, let us examine specific problems raised by our women in response to the government-initiated National Gender Equality Review. I shall focus the discussion on AWARE's Omnibus report on the special problems faced by Muslim women and PPIS submission, which to some extent overlaps with the ones raised by AWARE. I'll also highlight some of the cultural problems which I think ought to be of concern to PPIS but are omitted from its report. In July this year, AWARE released its report on gender equality in response to the National Gender Equality Review. It made 88 recommendations on many issues affecting women. It claimed that these recommendations are inclusive and represent the hope of many years of women's struggles. Muslim women, Malay women are not isolated from all the problems raised in the report, although with different degrees of intensity on some of these issues. There are few recommendations dealing with issues specifically on Muslim women. 4 of the 5 issues relate to the administration of Muslim law as expressed in AMLA. The report claimed that the framework of AMLA is based on the premise that, and I quote, regards men as the protectors and providers of women and grants additional rights and privileges to Muslim men as a result. This is actually a perception of AWARE, which is not expressed in AMLA itself. It is revealing of the attitude of the report towards AMLA as a legislation that privileges Muslim men. As I mentioned earlier on, there are many provisions in the AMLA that strengthen women's rights and protect their interests. It is comparable to progressive laws in many of the enactments of the Muslim law in the Malay states at that time. It also provides wide leverage for Muslim judges to apply the substantive law based on their understanding of the subject as well as Malay custom. AWARE's report highlighted concerns on 4 areas of the law: polygamy, the requirement of a wali or legal guardian, women's right to divorce, and the law of inheritance relating to the distribution of properties. These are similar issues which have been subjected to scrutiny by the government and MUIS in relation to CEDAW since the time Singapore ratified the convention in 1995. Many changes have been made both to the Women's Charter and AMLA to align the laws with CEDAW. A standing inter-ministry committee on CEDAW was created to oversee the implementation of the convention in Singapore. It comprises relevant ministries and public sector agencies which coordinate and implement initiatives under their purview to address the needs of women. Singapore's 5th periodic report to the UN Committee of CEDAW in 2015 listed the advances in both the law and the procedures provided for in AMLA with regards to women. However, Singapore continues to retain partial reservation, especially on Article 16, to accommodate, amongst other things, certain practices of Muslim law in AMLA. Article 16 deals with marriage and family life. The state's explanation of the application of Muslim law here regarding polygamy, wali, divorce, and inheritance attempt to mitigate the allegation that these laws discriminate women. They also help to distinguish similar laws practiced in some Muslim countries which are deemed discriminatory. The state argued that the reservation is necessary to protect the rights of minorities, referring to the Muslims, in the practice of their personal and religious law as set out in AMLA. The practice of Muslim law varies among countries according to the different schools of law adopted by the community and their cultural practices. The state defers to MUIS on the matter of Muslim law as practiced in Singapore. In 2017, AWARE released a shadow report, Many Voices, One Movement, prepared by the coalition of 13 NGOs. The report is a response to the 5th periodic report of CEDAW, and amongst other things, the report called for Singapore to withdraw its reservations on Article 16. They argued that the reservation suggests that the state believes that AMLA and Muslim values are incompatible with Article 16. The report commented on the state's explanation on the practice of Muslim law here and regard these practices as discriminatory. It, however, did not engage in a thorough discourse about the nature of these laws, their application, and their cultural and social consequences that merit rethinking of these laws. Aware, however, believe AMLA can be amended to protect Muslim communities' religious and cultural rights while extending equal treatment of Muslim men and women. It pointed to other Muslim countries like Turkey, Morocco, and Tunisia, which have different ways of practicing their Muslim laws. Aware's attempt to reintroduce its 2017 critique of Singapore Muslim laws in its recent report does not add additional research, input, and data in its effort to advocate change. While the laws highlighted by Aware do warrant rethinking to reflect the changing conditions of society, there are challenges in approach in engaging with stakeholders of the law, such as MUIS and other NGOs focusing on women. The model of advocacy of Sisters in Islam and Musawa, which confront religious scholars on their own turf, may not be the best strategy here. Lack of necessary resources and social capital to advocate for alternative form of Muslim laws reinforce the challenge. The problem of gender equality of Muslim women, or Aware, is crafted as a problem with the Muslim law. The way it wants to deal with equality is by proposing alternative forms of Muslim law which are deemed more equal or abolish certain elements which it thinks are objectionable, such as the symbolic existence of the law on wali. This approach invites immediate counter-resistance from the custodians of the law and those, including segments of Muslim women, who want to practice them for reasons best known to themselves, including the belief that these laws are immutable and central to faith. Aware may not have the resources to deal with that kind of resistance, nor may it want to do it that way. We may be deemed as authoritarian in advocating for such change for others who are quite comfortable with the laws. Muslim laws, like most religious laws, don't change easily, unlike civil laws, which change through democratic process. The orientation of stakeholders of the law also render the task of rethinking the law slower to change. Change in religious laws usually comes when it is subjected to political pressures or when they become irrelevant. By then, the laws will be forced to change. While I do not deny the need to engage with dominant stakeholders for the change of the Muslim law to ensure better gender equality that reflect the reality of changing conditions of Muslim society, and that this effort must be sustained, the legal arrangement of Muslim law binding on Muslims cannot be overlooked. This, to me, is a procedural challenge more than a substantive legal one. It is the legal arrangement in which the Muslim law binds all Muslims, irrespective of their status as equal citizens of the state, unless they abjure Islam, that presents issues for those seeking access to the civil law deemed to be more gender equal. Giving Muslims access to the civil law does not require the dismantling of Muslim laws. Let me give an example. If a Muslim has full access to the Wills Act, he or she has the liberty of making wills based on the faraid, if they wish to. Muslim couples who want to register their marriage under the Women's Charter, if both so wish, as a matter of civil requirement, and their religious outlook with regards to gender, can best be served by this arrangement, whereby their rights and obligations within the family are served by the civil laws like any other citizens. Any other matters regarding their religious obligations, like the nikah ceremony, can be done separately. Muslims who want to live well as good Muslims, where their basic religious practices are protected as a citizen, can do so like any other citizens by this kind of arrangement. We have to regard this proposed change in the arrangement as procedural and not substantive. To some extent, the process is also not something novel. Since 2 decades ago, 1999, AMLA has been amended by giving Muslim couples the option to pursue divorce-related matters on custody, disposition of property, and/or division of property in the family court. Enforcement of nafkah eda and muta'ah, as well as personal protection orders for Muslims, are also heard and determined in the civil court. This path or other aspects of the law should be made available for Muslims if they decide to do so. Protecting the rights of the minority must not deny their equal treatment under the law, including the protection of their religious outlook. This procedural change will also likely improve and strengthen Muslim law and the Sharia court. After the amendments in 1999, the Sharia court itself underwent changes with more resources to improve its processes and its judicial capacity. The appointment of civil law trained judges with substantive practice in Muslim law as Sharia court judges and court registrars improved judgments of the court and its processes. In the early days of reform of the Sharia court, the appointment of a civil trained judge was received with suspicion by the religious elite. Over time, as these judges have proven their competency in handling cases based on more systematic thought and application on Sharia laws, the resistance has gradually faded. The quality of judges improves thinking on substantive law and their applications. The Sharia court can now boast of women judges and registrars. With better judicial officers, hopefully, there will be quiet reform to some of the procedures which are unnecessarily tedious and cumbersome for women. I'm referring to hollow divorce, where the woman can seek divorce without showing cause. In divorce cases, emotional and psychological factors are major concerns for women. Men often use this as a weapon of revenge. The procedures for such cases will be further examined to ensure gender equality. I can see that my colleague, Professor Farid, is already shifting in his chair. I'm so sorry if this talk is very, very long, but I'm about to finish. Over time, the views of religious elites about the Muslim law will evolve and cultural lag can be bridged. Already now, our religious elites have been trying to think about how to provide Muslims with the instruments to make wills by invoking new legal concepts like nuzria and hiba rukbah. However, how these can be properly developed as unique instruments protected by law is still far from clear. Many other recommendations of aware that affect women are equally important, and Muslim leaders have to be concerned with examining them. Problems faced by women who are marginalized due to socioeconomic status, legal status, or even their sexual orientations should not be outside our area of concern. Their problems are often multidimensional. Muslim leaders and intelligentsia may not agree with the approach taken by organizations like AWARE, but surely they must have cognizance of the existential problems that they have raised about women and address these concerns. Perhaps it is in these areas that AWARE is best positioned to work with MUIS in research and data collection and engagement in understanding the problems, especially on disadvantaged groups, to help improve lives and better serve their needs. Many of these problems may not lie with the laws, but access to resources and social services. I'll just like to highlight a little bit about PPIS's response to the Gender Equality Project to get the sense of the frustration of certain segments of the Malay community. I'm relying on the executive summary of the report. The full text of the report is not publicly available. PPIS has taken a slightly different focus on the problem of gender equality. The title of the report, Shaping Mindsets Towards Gender Equality, the Muslim Community's Perspective, contains several recommendations for Singapore's review on women's issues, reflects its focus. The report is the outcome of conversations with a total of 42 community leaders and members of the public of varying ages, professions, background, and gender on areas such as women leadership, unpaid work, workplace discrimination, sexual objectification of women. PPIS stated that the discussion provided them with insights into the prevalent social norms specific to the Muslim community that impede gender equality. From the method of study, its areas of focus and findings, it is not too presumptuous to infer that gendered social norms, as the report described, seems to be the main source of frustration of the educated Muslim women. PPIS highlighted cultural inhibitions to voice their opinions, gender role expectations, the struggle to balance family and work life that stifle women's potential and growth, and their role in leadership, as well as gendered barriers, cultural prejudice, and discrimination. Gender inequality is also seen in cultural expectations of women's role as the primary caregivers of the family, lack of compensation and acknowledgement of this role. Furthermore, sexual objectification of women is also one of the major concerns of the report. The demeaning attitude towards women that reduce them to sex objects, according to the report, is still common in all demographic and age groups in Singapore. It makes women vulnerable to domestic violence and abuse and creates hostile work environment for women. The report also stated that when sexualized representations of girls and women are institutionalized in the cultural fabric of a society, sexualization will be seen as an accepted norm. The sense of frustration dealing with this problem is clearly very intense. However, it is unclear if the statement is a warning about the phenomena or an indictment of Singapore Muslim society. The report highlighted that casual sexism is a norm in our community, and women are expected not to take it seriously. It is unclear from the executive report if and what PPIS has identified as gendered social norms. It is not known whether PPIS has identified prevalent religious views about women, which form what it maintains as gendered social norms, as Islam is, after all, a major element in our cultural life. If the report is an indictment of our community's social norms and cultural perceptions on women, these must be clearly identified. The carriers or propagators must be clearly highlighted so that the problem can be meaningfully addressed. Glossing over the cultural and social impediments without identifying the elements that cause them and the carriers responsible for them will not help educate the community on proper attitudes towards gender equality. Perceptions of women as objects of temptation and stereotypes of both sexes and their gendered roles are commonly disseminated in religious sermons and texts. Traditional roles of husbands and wives, which are cultural legacies of the past, have been promoted as reflecting male gender superiority over women in all fields. It is no wonder that even till today, Muslim women are underrepresented in leadership positions in mosques and Muslim organizations. This is very prevalent. I'm sure our educated religious elite has a proper non-gender bias explanation of its meaning, but then there is no serious efforts to correct the toxic understanding. The recent incident of some young men making toxic sexist practical jokes on social media, not realizing the power of social media to cause so much psychological harm to our young ladies, highlight how sexuality of women is seen as a fair game for jokes. It should not be taken seriously until the power of social media showed them the damage that they have done to the ladies and to themselves. I can go on with a long list of examples, but it will not make any difference if our intelligentsia do not come on board to stop the rot. It is not the responsibility of PPIS only to champion for gender equality. I think organizations like Progress can play a very important role to promote gender equality, or at the very least help fight toxic views about women. I would like to make one last observation before I wrap my lecture. We must be aware that gender inequality manifests and impacts different groups differently. Those in the lower socioeconomic groups often experience inequality on multiple dimensions. Their socioeconomic conditions may be compounded by other psychological and physical disabilities, or simply marginalized because of their sexual constituents and orientations. The resources available to them to address their problems are limited. Community intelligentsia, including community organizational leaders, often think that the challenges they face with gender inequality are the same for all women. The privileged usually have better capacity and capital to address these challenges, but not so for the underprivileged. AWARE has made representations on some of the plight of this group. PPIS, with its network of services for the underprivileged, have access to their stories. The existential problems and concerns, such as with adequacy of wages, lack of relevant skills, single parenthood, mental illness, and other disabilities which have direct repercussions on their empowerment, need to be given a voice. There are also other marginal voices, like those we see expressed in Beyond Hijab and Growing Up Perempuan, that needs to be listened to. One cannot assert that one's views represent the Muslim community if the issues of concern to the disadvantaged and marginalized are absent. I think there is room for their stories to be captured and represented in the effort towards addressing gender equality. I have discussed 3 major episodes affecting the community. Each of these invoke different areas and challenges: religion, culture, history, and gender. How our elite and intelligentsia in these areas have responded to these issues not only reflect their perspectives and sense of issues, but also shape and define our culture, our sense of history, that are imperative in navigating contemporary challenges of change and development as a community. What I've tried to capture is not only what they have given attention to, but what they have missed, overlooked, or stifled, why and what effects these bear on us. I've also tried to emphasize in each of these episodes that the elites and intelligentsia of the community cannot afford not to be grounded in their own progressive cultural intellectual traditions within the region and beyond, but also creatively and critically harness the relevant contributions of others for our development. There must be a commitment to engaging with genuine ideas on relevant problems. This is not a simple exercise of inviting scholars from everywhere in the world, but the making of a serious social force that can strengthen our social institutions. Thank you for bearing with me and for the time. Assalamualaikum. Thank you, Noor Aisha, for such a deep insight. I think if I understand correctly, Shahril, by that question is meant whether we have the resources to counter utopian mentalities as well as ideological frameworks or systems of thinking. I think this question, right, is to me, right, it's not a matter of whether we have or not. We definitely have, right? You know, the Malay community is not a homogeneous community. There are already people who are educated within this community. They have studied, many of them, definitely, better, more well-educated, more exposed. But they definitely need to create more awareness of the problems that they definitely have to be conscious, right, of their own ideological trappings. I think if you have the proper tools, the proper perspective, the proper concepts, and of course this require your reading, this require your engagement with many groups around. I mentioned to you about the contribution of my department, for example, all these years in teaching this very subject about utopianism, about radical thinking, about ideology, through our curriculum, etc. And of course, not just my department, right? I mean, most of you who are educated, you are exposed to all kinds of knowledge that will grant you the tools and the perspective to develop and to be critical of views that you know are not grounded, are highly rhetorical, especially if these views pertain to significant issues that we are confronted with. So I don't know whether you can wait for a time where there is enough, right? There will always be those already that exist. The issue here is whether those who have these tools are willing to commit themselves to write, to engage, to talk, and express their opinions using multiple platforms, right? To challenge and to find out more about why this phenomena is, ravaging in our midst. Yeah. So I'm not, I would, my response to that question would be definitely we can do that, right? There's already a stream of writings, a stream of publications that are doing that. You can see a lot of these publications are also written by members within our own community as well as from the region. There's a lot to be tapped from the region. I think the Malay community cannot isolate itself from the intellectual resources of the region and of course beyond, right? But the fact that we have them in our region, in Malaysia, especially in Indonesia, it is a waste to omit these people's contributions. So like I said earlier, right, I mean, this is a question of how the issue is to be managed. How do you get the state to listen to you, right, with regards to your demands or what you deem to be important for your religious outlook? This is, how do you do that? I don't know. I mean, there are ways of doing that, I'm sure. This involves, of course, getting your community leaders on board. Not those, of course, who will not be understanding of what you are advocating, but those who are compassionate, those who are understanding first, try and get their support to understand the implications of what you are trying to say. Think of ways that will think of what are the sense of insecurity that this may give rise to, right, from counter groups, and think of how to make them understand that at the end of the day, there are certain challenges that are unavoidable that have to be resolved. We can't, because, out of fear of, resistance, that everybody else who do not agree with the dominant view have to just subject themselves to this view. There must be definitely ways of engaging. And like I said, Singapore has already, interministerial committees have been formed, right, by the state. The state has deferred to major stakeholders in the community to engage them in order to respond to some of these changes and some of the demands of CEDAW. And there are already people who are coming on board, right, to articulate these views. In many areas also, there has been Article 16 itself has been subjected to several reviews and changes, and there are only now a few areas that needs to be removed. And if there are problems with that, and I'm not saying don't engage, you have to continue this conversation. You have to bring people whom you feel can understand the situation on board, right? This could be your political leaders who are more open to such engagement. And also, while this is going on, right, you must also think about articulating it as a procedural issue, because when you talk about the change as a substantive Islamic issue, I think it incurs much more either dissatisfaction or misconceptions or unnecessary insecurity. So it's how you frame the issue. I think that matters a lot as well. It is in no way an attempt to undermine the Sharia law as it exists. It's no way an attempt to challenge it. This is giving a new channel, right, for people who feel that their interests may be better served by the alternative legal system and laws. So there's nothing being taken away from that. And I think over time, like I said in my lecture just now, over time, right, such a move may even strengthen the Sharia law or the Islamic law that is practiced here, as well as the courts, like what it did in 1999. In 1999, when there was an amendment to the AMLA to allow for Muslim parties to have certain matters of dispute relating to custody and property to be heard in the Sharia court, and AMLA had to be amended for that. There was a lot of resentment, but over time you see that the institution coped with all these challenges. You see that there is improvement in the quality of judgments, etc. And I think this ecosystem is very important. This interaction between the civil court and the Sharia court is very important. It helps to strengthen the Sharia court as well. And so this is the call for a procedural channel. It's not totally novel or new. To me, it is part of that ongoing process that allows Muslims, right, to have that option as a citizen to move on to choose and what they want to do, consistent with their religious beliefs, without having to abjure Islam, without having to claim that they are non-Muslims, which is going to be very terrible for the community. Yeah, by totality of Islam in the book, right? It is not about totality of Islam in the matter of principles or values. All of us as Muslims understand that Islam is a total, in a way, a comprehensive religion. That we have been provided with a complete set of values that are sufficient. There's no more need for that expansion of values, right? That these values are complete in that sense. So by totality of Islam, right, the common man, people like non-fundamentalists, they believe, right, that these values will be relevant, they suffice and they are relevant to govern or to regulate our lives, whether in the personal sphere or in the public sphere, right? They can underline the institutions and the or the social institutions of our people. But by the totality of Islam that is referred to in this book, this totality of Islam is not like that. It's not in the form of a body of complete principles here that are already revealed to Muslims, right? This totality of Islam is meant totality of systems. Yeah. So they believe, right, that it is that systems are divinely decreed. So for example, you have a parliamentary system. They don't call it parliamentary system, they call it the Shura. So this is a system of lawmaking which is divinely decreed. They have systems of an economic system that's divinely decreed. So the legal system that's divinely decreed, etc. So there's a difference in terms of the understanding of what's totality of Islam here. And that also actually is related to the first question, which is about the traits of fundamentalism. So as far as fundamentalists is concerned, not only do they believe in these systems as decreed, not as something that evolves, right, through the evolution of civilizations, but also they believe that these are non-questionable. So this is a given, this is mandatory, this is integral to faith, and these must be implemented if you have the political strength or the power to implement it. So basically, right, this is the fundamentalist mode, as in they're rigid. They do not think that certain aspects of the faith can be questioned, and one aspect of the faith that they deem to be fixed is basically the belief in this system.
Right.
So the only thing that prevents them from allowing these things to be implemented or enabling these things to be implemented is because they are politically emasculated, they are weak. So in principle, for them, it means that if they are in power, there is no question that these things must be implemented. So for example, hudud is mentioned but not clearly defined. This must be implemented, right? Shura must be implemented and things like that. Tudong also must be implemented. These are mentioned as mandatory in the book.
Right. Thank you, Prof. Maybe one last question I read from the Slido. Actually, there are three quite related questions, so we'll treat this as the last question. It's about the religious elites, basically. So there was a question on the ARS. There was a question on the education. So maybe I take this question. What are your thoughts about the progress and the current state of religious education here? Specifically the curriculum and the pedagogy, and maybe related to that, maybe are there rooms for improvements and reforms?
I think the best person to answer this question is Dr. Norshahril himself. Yeah, he spent years studying about religious education and asatizas and all that. But generally, I think I don't think that whatever I'm going to say is going to be very conflicting with what he has. In fact, our recent book is a joint publication together with Dr. Azhar. And what we found, of course, is that to a large extent, religious education, I'm not talking about religious education in Singapore, the madrasah system, I'm talking about tertiary religious education. It's still quite medieval, if I may use the word, in terms of the way of teaching and learning. Right? It's still very much based on memorization of classical texts, and it is still not infused with social sciences, for example, in the understanding of theology or in the understanding of religious disciplines. Very few countries in this world, in the Muslim world, actually have adopted a different or modern approach to teaching religion, substantively as well as pedagogically. One can look at, for example, the Indonesian experience, right, in their UINs, or the University Islam Negeri, in which there has been reform, rethinking about religious education, and in which they have incorporated the social sciences into the teaching of theology. Apart from that, of course, there are a few other colleges in the West, maybe in Cambridge, Oxford, where theology is taught with modern knowledge, with a lot of emphasis on philosophy, etc. But to a large extent, I think the Muslim world's religious education still can be said to be quite traditionalistic, while education, and modes of learning and teaching have undergone and still undergoing very, rapid change. Right? These institutions are still pretty much insulated. Even in certain countries where we are trying to send our asatizas to today, at least for MUIS, right, there is still a strong encouragement to send them instead of Al-Azhar to maybe Jordan. Even in these countries also, right, in the teaching of religion, not the other subjects that we're talking about, but in the teaching of religion, although they have grand buildings, right, maybe they have all the equipments, the modern equipments, etc. The approach to teaching and learning religion is still traditionalistic. So I don't know whether that answers the question, Shahril.
think you do. I think those are areas that we tend to overlook. Of course, I think this is consistent with what you also say in your lecture, that sometimes we tend to go so far and look at models in the Middle East, but sometimes we forget about the region, particularly what's the debates that's happening in our region, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia, and this also applies to the issue of religious education, where there has been substantive reforms, substantive engagements. There are, of course, problems. Of course, Indonesia is a big country. There are, of course, problems, but there are areas in which we can learn from their own experience. And I think this is quite consistent with your lecture today. I think I really benefited a lot, Prof, from your lecture. I think you have talked about those three broad issues. And I think what's consistent in your message is sometimes there are dominant ideas in the community championed by certain groups, but there's always we are always blindsided by alternative voices, alternative discourses, alternative ways of looking at things. And I think there's a lot to learn from our heritage, from our history, that I think we can also engage for the sake of progress for our community. So thank you very much, Prof. That's the time that we have for this session, but the conversation should not stop here, because it's a normal practice for our speakers to also later publish the paper. And I see that Prof has already prepared the paper, so just give us some time maybe to process this and upload this on our website. So feel free to download this. These are free and available, and the lecture is also recorded and also available on our social media platforms. And I hope the conversation should not stop here. We should continue engaging. And of course, I'm sure Prof is also open, right? If there's further questions, and you can also write to her, and also she's happy to answer. And she also mentioned in her lecture that she has published extensively on these issues. And I think these are basically some of the areas which I think on the surface, she has touched on, but I think further elaboration on those ideas are available in her publication. So maybe without further ado, I hand back to Julina to conclude the session.